Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney. I'm here with Dr. Nathan French. And today we have a special guest with us, Jonathan Finley. He's a friend. He's a great man. He has a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh, and he has a master's of theology in biblical studies. We're very excited to have him on today. We're going to talk about the book of Hosea, where he wrote his master's dissertation on. So really excited about that. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I wonder if you can first just talk about just the book of Hosea. What inspired you to study this book in depth? Because I think all of us have different levels of intensity that we approach different things in our lives. And there might be something we're interested in for a few days or a few weeks. But for you to go the length that you have in writing an entire master's dissertation at your university about this, what kind of inspired you to say, I love this book so much, I want to do this much research on it?
Yeah. Well, I think with Hosea, my relationship with Hosea actually goes back to my very first Bible class in undergraduate. I had a prophets class with Dr. Lyons, and everyone was really wanting to do a paper on Hosea. And I didn't understand why. I didn't know anything about the book, but it seemed like probably because of the well-known story of Hosea and Gomer, it was just captivating all of the students, the story of love and redemption. And so when it came time to pick a topic, I did Hosea 11. And that chapter is just full of all of this really intense emotional language and metaphor of God as father to Israel, the son, and this kind of turmoil within Yahweh's heart. And so I always really enjoyed writing that paper. And when it came time to pick a topic for my dissertation, I knew I wanted to do something in the prophets. So I started to look through the various prophets, and actually specifically I was looking for something like an intertextuality. I really like to see how the Hebrew Bible references itself, how it's interconnected. And so I read through Hosea, just kind of remember that former paper. And I think it's funny that I ended up doing the very next chapter, Hosea 12, for my master's dissertation. So it felt like coming full circle. And I think, like I said, the language of it, the metaphors, the imagery is just top notch. And I like all of that linguistic stuff, the literary aspects of it. So I really enjoyed writing the paper, and Hosea is just a beautiful book.
Yeah, that's cool hearing about how your master's work really built on your undergrad work. That's kind of cool just
Yeah.
seeing how it's building on itself.
Yeah.
Now we'll see, what your PhD will do or won't do, but that's kind of cool when you can see that combined. Which, by the way, Oral Roberts, that's where we met. I worked with your wife and ended up connecting with you, realizing we have so many similarities. This is awesome.
Yeah.
It's part of the reason we started the Hebrew Bible Book Club on our Patreon page is because we want people to connect with more people who like reading the Hebrew Bible. They enjoy that, and that's not a weird conversation topic.
Yeah.
So shameless plug for that, by the way, description in the show notes below if anyone wants to check that out.
Well, it's good too. I think it's good for our listeners and any students out there who are listening. It is true that at the undergraduate level, you can really find the topic that can take you all the way through even the postgraduate level, the PhD levels. It does happen. Yeah. So you're kind of hitting on it, but maybe give us an elevator pitch for the book of Hosea. What's the maybe summarize the flow of the book for any of our listeners here that need sort of a good background to what Hosea is doing.
Right. So I think Hosea is a prototypical prophet in that he reveals Yahweh's perspective on just the everyday life. Because like when you read through the Torah, the historical books, you see Yahweh doing these amazing feats of deliverance, like the Exodus story, the wilderness wanderings. And you can see God is imminently present for Israel. But then when you read the prophets, you see from the everyday man's perspective how Yahweh acts just in the day to day. And I think that really reveals God's care and love for Israel beyond just the amazing miracles and all those stories that we look back on and appreciate. We could see God loves his people, even when there's all this turmoil and devastation happening around the world, which is always applicable even today. So Hosea, I think, really does capture the love of God, captures the relationship that Yahweh has with his people. And he uses, like I said, a lot of really vivid imagery and metaphor to get that point across. And so I think reading this book will really round out our theology and our perspective of who God is and who we are. It's a beautiful treatise, I think, of God's care for us and who we are. So
Well, sign me up. Or wait, actually, we're already here in the podcast. Just keep going. Excellent. I'm actually curious too. The other question that Nathan asked actually is kind of what's the big picture of Hosea, if you can kind of summarize, because I think I think it's one of the important muscles for us to develop in our Hebrew Bible interpretation. I think some people get so caught up in one line or one scene that we forget that this is playing one part
Good
in a
point. Yep.
grander narrative.
Mhm.
And that look, people say let's not take things out of context. Well, one of the best ways to do that is, do we understand what's the story of Exodus, or what is the book of Hosea? So obviously we can't go super in depth here, but maybe you can just help us understand a little bit of what's the overall flow of this whole book.
right. So Hosea was a northern prophet. His ministry was based, in the 8th century, so like 722 before the northern tribes were exiled by Assyria. You can read the story of a lot of the events in Kings. The Book of Kings details a lot of that. And so his ministry is set during a time of a lot of idolatry. The way the book is set up, the first 3 chapters details Hosea's marriage to Gomer. A lot of people know this part of the story. And I think those chapters perfectly summarize the themes, the concerns of Hosea, and really gives us, in, I think, a very moving tale, Yahweh's care and love for Israel. I think, Matthew, you use this analogy all the time. It's like the story of Sinai and the golden calf is like, on, 2 people get married and on their honeymoon, the spouse goes off and cheats. And that story is being replayed here in these first few chapters, seeing Hosea going to Gomer and then leaving. Gomer leaves for, other lovers, and Yahweh has to woo her back. And so it's a story of Israel's punishment by Yahweh, but then chapter 3 has a note of hope, of reconciliation, of the Davidic king returning. So you see this pattern of judgment followed by mercy, and that repeats through the other sections of the book. So chapters 4 to 11 go into more detail logistically. What are the violations? What are the covenantal violations that Israel has broken with Yahweh? And so we see different ideas like I said, idolatry. We see reliance on foreign powers. So going back to Egypt, relying on Pharaoh, or trying to wheel and deal treaties with the Assyrian king or whatnot. So instead of relying on Yahweh, the people rely on their political might or their treaties and whatnot. And then also social concerns as well, mistreating the poor, the needy, that type of thing. And once again, like those first 3 chapters, when we get to the end, chapter 11, there's also a note of hope, a note of reconciliation, where Yahweh comes to bring the judgment. But then in that famous verse, he says, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How could I turn you over like Adamah, like Zeboim," which is the cities around like Sodom and Gomorrah? How can he bring that total devastation? And he said he won't. And I think the key verse in that chapter is when he says, "I will not execute judgment. I am God, no man, the Holy One in your midst." And I think that, when I said, is the depiction of the heart of God, is not to bring the judgment. You would think if anyone had the right to execute judgment, it would be the divine, it would be the Holy One. But it's actually in his divine power to forgive, to not bring total devastation on Israel. And so that is really, you could stop the book right there. Chapter 11 is a wonderful ending right there. But then we get a little tack on chapters 12 to 14, replay some of the same concerns, but now we get these allusions to the past. So chapter 12 is where I did a lot of my research on the Jacob tradition, and he references the wilderness wanderings like in Exodus. And then he also talks about in later chapters like the old kingship, Saul, and these other stories. And so it basically replays the same concerns, but seeing how events from the past are relevant to what's happening in the present, in Hosea's present day. And then once again, the last chapter ends on a note of reconciliation. So that's how the book kind of is structured. And so when I talk about Hosea 12, we need to remember that this is in a context of the Lord bringing accusations against Israel. It's it's a charges against Israel. So it's a note of judgment.
That's excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent
very nice.
summary.
Very nice. Yeah, excellent. I really like two things that I'd love to sort of go down a rabbit trail. Whether or not we can, I don't know. But obviously, covenant and marriage. It's interesting that marriage, the institution of human marriage, is the way in which at least some of these books, this book included, describe that covenant with Yahweh and Israel. And I don't know. Have you thought deeply on that at all? Is there anything you could comment further on that? Like why? I mean, I think we know why. It's one of it's the deepest and most committed relationship I think we have in society. But it's still interesting that is sort of the main metaphor for covenant from an ancient Near Eastern perspective. Yeah. So
No,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the call for chesed, for faithfulness, for fidelity, that is perfectly applicable to when we talk about marriage. I think the way the marriage contract is conceived, it is a joining of two people to be one, right? You go back to Genesis, that story there with Adam and Eve and whatnot. And so I think that story, that context, that metaphor of marriage really does call attention to what the Lord wants, and that is faithfulness. There's the famous verse also in Hosea 6:6 that that he wants faithfulness, not sacrifice. So that's a major theme in the book. It's this idea of fidelity to one, that the Lord is exclusive, and so.
And that fits perfectly, obviously, with, as M.Th has said, as you were saying, Exodus 32, 33, and 34, making that very clear in the Lord's fidelity and his deep commitment to the contract. Yeah, that was very good.
I think what we're talking about is really important for Hebrew Bible studies. I find especially people who are really familiar with the New Testament and are thinking also Hebrew Bible, trying to compare, they'll often think the New Testament, that's the location where intimate human family metaphors are used in bulk, whether that's talking about the idea of father or the idea of a husband, wife. But that just comes from cherry picking the Hebrew Bible. As Dr. French and I, we've done a number of episodes or Hebrew Bible Book Club discussions on Patreon where we talk about the really important theme of divine sonship throughout the Hebrew Bible, and the importance of fatherhood. And the same is true with the marriage metaphor, the marriage analogy. So the relationship that Yahweh has with his people Israel is one that's used in very significant sections, using some of the most intimate family analogies that you can have, whether that's the father-son or the husband-wife. So I think it's an important thing to hear.
And, related to that, of course, is the repeated phrase of Da'at Adonai, the knowledge of Yahweh, the knowledge of the Lord.
It's good.
And I think Hosea, he talks about knowledge, as most people know, yada, to know, is beyond just a rote duty or just a knowledge, in the head, but there's a personal aspect to it. And so I think that plays perfectly well into the marriage metaphor and what Yahweh is looking for with his people. And so, I agree, definitely, Matthew.
In fact, one of those verses you're alluding to in Hosea, I forget where this is, but one of the most famous verses that's quoted in education context from Hosea is, "My people perish for a lack of knowledge." And I've heard people use this as a verse and I've had students who have told me about their experiences where it's been used to say that the point is, don't be stupid or else you will perish. That's why you need to work really hard in your studies. But that begs the question, what kind of knowledge is being discussed? And that verse in Hebrew, actually the word for knowledge has the definite article. My people perish for a lack of ha-da'at. Very simple difference. My people perish for lack of the knowledge.
Mm,
Okay, well, that begs the question, the knowledge of what?
yeah.
And if you read the context of the chapter and these sections, it's clearly talking about Da'at Elohim, the knowledge of God, or
Mm,
Da'at Yahweh, the knowledge of Yahweh. And
yeah.
within the broader metaphor, this is referring to the marriage stuff going on.
That's good.
So really, this is what's getting at is my people perish because they are not being faithfully intimate to me in how they are handling everything that they're doing. It's
Yeah.
not they're bad at Bible trivia.
Sure.
So to be clear, we love education here. We're professors, we
Yeah.
think it's really important to learn things, but like what's the
The main point.
orienting principle? And
Mm,
that in the
Right.
Hebrew Bible is the
mm,
covenant relationship. The Hebrew
yeah.
Bible is not just a list of maxims and proverbs and good thoughts. Everything, even wisdom literature, is delivered with the assumption of the covenant relationship.
Yeah. Well, and this was
Right.
true across many of the covenants across the ancient Near East. I mean, the higher in the covenant at times, especially in the suzerain and vassal treaties, would often say, "You have not known me," right? Or "Why haven't
Yes.
you known me?" So it will use that very intimate language in that way to talk about faithfulness, as Jonathan pointed out, and as you're pointing out, is that there is a deep sense of knowing the other with whom you are in covenant, right, in this relationship with. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And,
many would benefit from that. I never forget the first time, Nathan, you mentioned this, which is that yada is not just okay, interesting Hebrew Bible usage in marriage, but knowing in the broader ancient Near East that Semitic root and
yeah,
that category is used in covenant
yeah,
context. So,
treaties and covenants. Yeah,
Jonathan, what were you going to say?
yeah,
yeah, no, I think one of the reasons some of that can be overlooked is when we read the prophets, there's very harsh language at times. We talk about judgment
yeah.
oracles, that sometimes that's all we
We
as
think
modern
about.
readers can really think about. It's,
Mhm.
we forget all of those other aspects because it can seem like the way prophets work, it just kind of vacillates between these two different images. But I think the truth is we're supposed to hold them both together. And
Mm.
it can seem like they're
Mm,
contradictory, but they're really not.
yeah,
The only
that's
reason
excellent.
that
Oh, keep
yeah,
going. Yeah, keep
the only
going.
reason we have these judgment oracles is because Yahweh cares. Otherwise,
Yeah,
if there wasn't anything, like apathy would be the opposite of true care and love. And
Yeah.
if anything, God is not apathetic. So
yeah. Well, and that's what you brought. That was sort of the second thing was your chapter 11. The point being that Yahweh doesn't want to bring the punishment, i.e., the curse or the retribution. He really wants to bring forgiveness and he wants reconciliation. That's what he's working toward. This is why I always like to push back against this deeply, and though it is there on some level, this idea of act consequence within retribution. It is part of the wisdom tradition, part of ancient Near Eastern thinking. But I push back heavy on that in my work to say, look, from a Hebrew Bible perspective, the way the ancients understood retribution was much more loving and caring than something like act consequence. I would hate for retribution only to be within act consequence because there's no mercy. There's no one to whom you can cry out. But if you can cry out to the one who does the punishing, in this case, Yahweh, he makes it clear I'm willing to change. I'm willing to go back on this because I want reconciliation. I want forgiveness. I want ultimate good and healing for my people. And I
right.
thought you did well to really point that out with Hosea here. Like you said, you could end it with 11, and that would be interesting. But it doesn't end with 11. In fact, chapter 12 is what you did all of your work on. So tell us, you have somewhat already, but really dive into chapter 12 here and tell us what makes this ripe for literary analysis.
Right. Well, if you just read the chapter just casually reading through, I think it feels really disjointed because we just come off of this conclusion in the last chapter of the Lord saying he's not going to execute the judgment. And then we get, another setup for God bringing charges against Israel. So we're kind of repeating the same pattern. And then the thing that really kind of caught me was when you read it, he sets it up like he's going to bring charges against the people, but then he starts talking about Jacob. And Jacob is not, in this case, another name for Israel, the people. It's Jacob, the ancestor. Jacob, like we know from the stories in Genesis. And so, you know, how is the story of Jacob applicable here? And I think some of that confusion, as well as some of the intense literary structuring, the repeated key words, some of those literary aspects make it ripe for literary analysis. Otherwise, we risk just missing the whole point of what's really going on here.
So one of the things that you especially lean into in your work is the use of Jacob, not as a referent to just Ephraim or Israel as a polity, but referring to, hey, Jacob's back. This character from
Yeah.
Genesis, here he is making a cameo. Like Stanley in a Marvel movie. Like, what's he doing here? So I wonder if you can, we're about to really dive deep into your work, but maybe just before we do that real deep dive, can you just mention what's at stake here? Like, let's, why, just before we even begin this interpretive quest, why does it matter to figure out what's going on with Jacob being mentioned here?
Right. Well, for one, it's pretty rare to see this kind of reference to a patriarch. We don't have a lot of them in outside the Torah, at least. So just from that aspect alone, it's interesting to see how does a prophet interpret the story of Jacob. I think that's an interesting part of it. But also just in the context of Hosea, understanding how does the story of Jacob relate to Israel's present day, and what is the logic behind that? I think that's kind of the heart behind my quest, is understanding how do these biblical authors understand their own history, their own ancestry, and how does that show up in the rhetoric? How does that inform the charges against Israel? What's the relevance there? And so, as I kind of say in my thesis, I think the way scholars typically answer the question is either Jacob is a model of repentance or he is exemplary Israel's sin. And I think it's both. You really see both of those aspects in there. And so I think that complements Hosea's goals overall, which we see really throughout the structure. As I mentioned, there's messages of both condemnation, of judgment, and of hope. And I think Israel, Jacob, the ancestor, really has both of those in there. So you kind of see this complexity. And I think any kind of reading I can find that brings out some of those nuances, I just find interesting. And you get to, I think, glean more from the chapter than you would otherwise.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. So, on that note, why don't you walk us through Hosea 12 and share with us some of what you have learned in your research?
Yeah, all right. So, if you're reading along in your Bibles, chapter 12, my research is in the Hebrew chapter 12, which the versification is slightly different. In the English, I'll be starting in Hosea 11, verse 12, and continuing from there. So, this is the NRSV translation. It says, Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, the house of Israel with deceit. We'll pause right here. Mirma, deceit. We're going to put that in our back pocket, save that for later because it's going to come up again later. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. We could also stop right there and rod. That verb is really notoriously difficult, knowing what does that mean. The still walks with God, whatever. So we'll save that for later. Ephraim herds the wind, pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a treaty with Assyria, and oils carried to Egypt. This is a nice summary of what we've been talking about to this point. He specifically mentions the reliance on foreign powers, the mirma, the deceit that Jacob exemplifies, also is somehow characteristic of Israel, the people. And then as we move on, we see specifically how that relationship bears out. It says the Lord has an indictment. That's a reeve, a contention with or against Judah. Which that's interesting. We can also talk about Hosea is based in Israel. That's the northern tribe. But then we get this mention of Judah. So somehow both Judah and the northern tribes are kind of lumped together in this. It says, and will punish Jacob according to his ways and will pay him according to these deeds. So right here, we see the first mention of Jacob. But the way it's paired with Judah, you would expect he's talking about the people Jacob. I mean, why would he bring charges against the patriarch when he's been dead hundreds of years? So Jacob here is referring to the people Jacob, the Israel, the northern tribes. and it says it will pay him according to his deeds. We'll see that phrase also appear, the Yashiv Lo, that will appear at the end here. So it's a nice bookend for this whole charge coming up. And then starting in verse 3 in the English or verse 4 in the Hebrew, he starts reciting some of the major plot points in Jacob's story. If you read Genesis, you'll see the whole saga laid out. It says, in the womb, he tried to supplant his brother. We can stop right there. That's also an interesting thing because the verb akav, that's where we get in Genesis the popular etymology behind Yaakov, Jacob's name. And in that story, we know Jacob seizing his brother Esau's heel. So some translations might even go with grabbing his heel. I think the ESV maybe has like grabs his heel or something like that. In this context, we don't have any mention of the heel. I think it's more the idea of supplanting or subverting, deceiving, that kind of metaphorical idea of a kav. And then in his manhood, the second half of the verse, he strove with God. So this is a nice, I think, example of what the mirma, of what the deceit means in the first verse I pointed out. Basically, in the whole of Jacob's life, from even before he was born to his full strength, the uv-ono, that manhood there is own, his strength, he strove with God. So we have this idea, this theme of contention, going back to the reeve I talked about, set up as a contention Yahweh has with his people. And it seems in this verse, Jacob is the one who initiates. He strives with God. And then the next verse, this is where it gets a little complicated. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. So that is really interesting. If you go back and read Genesis 32, the story of Jacob, it says, that he wrestles with an ish, with a man or something. It's really mysterious and notoriously ambiguous. What exactly is Jacob wrestling here? And here, Hosea at first refers to his wrestling mate as God, but then it says it again as an angel. So what do we do with that? Ultimately, my research didn't have to necessarily settle that question. I think for Hosea's purposes here, it's more the idea that Jacob is initiating this conflict with the divine. He's wrestling with his divine opponent. And so whether we understand that to be an angel of Yahweh or Yahweh himself, maybe even this change in language might reflect some of the ambiguousness in Genesis itself, or some of that obscurity there. Either way, it says he prevailed. Now, when you read scholarly literature and some of the articles that have been written about this verse, it's kind of unclear as well how the verbs work here, because we see a whole series of verbs and it's unclear exactly who's doing what. Sort of like that story in Genesis as well, where it talks about the back and forth and the dialogue there. It's also kind of unclear who prevailed. Is it the angel? Is it Jacob? I think the logic of how this works, it's Jacob who prevails. And so we see Jacob wrestling with this divine opponent, and that probably explains why it says angel here as well, to maybe kind of smooth over that kind of awkward implication that Jacob defeats Yahweh in some sense. So it's kind of like a clarification there. It's not really, but more like an angel or something like that, maybe. But then we get this next line, which really doesn't make any sense. He wept and sought his favor. Okay, who's weeping? Who's seeking whom's favor, and why? Because if Jacob is the subject of these verbs, which I think is probable, given there's no other change in subject that's clear in the Hebrew, then why would he go from wrestling with the angel and prevailing to then turning and weeping? And I think this is where my thesis of Jacob being both a symbol of judgment and a symbol of reconciliation plays in very heavily here. We see these two images of a victorious Jacob, but then weeping and seeking favor. This phrase here, the Baha Vayit Hanen Lo, is very interesting. We see that phrase also used in the book of Esther. where Esther entreats on behalf of the people before the king. I think this image is one of someone humbling themselves before an overseer, of a suzerain, of a king, and supplicating for mercy. I think that is the implication here. And because as we read on, especially in verse 6, when we see the return to the Lord, the call for repentance, I think the implication is that Jacob is exemplifying what Israel should therefore do, and humble themselves, entreat Yahweh to weep and seek his favor, as Jacob does. Now, the complication with that, and really regardless of how you interpret it, is when we compare Genesis, there's really no clear reference to weeping and seeking favor. So what do we do with that? And of course, when we talk about the dating of these texts, and the development of the Jacob story and as we understand it, there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of things we don't know. So it's hard to know for sure what exactly to make of it. Interestingly enough, there is, in the next chapter in Genesis, after the scene of the wrestling, we read the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau, and there's repeated words of Jacob weeping and seeking favor. There's in that moment, brother and brother are reconciled. And I think that also kind of goes back to the previous verse we just read, where it says he strove with his brother, or tried to deceive his brother. And so I think this reference of weeping and seeking favor kind of does like a double entendre. It sort of, I think, does both in a way of exemplifying Israel's posture of what they should, in the same way that Jacob weeps and seeks favor. Israel should also do that, in the sense of, like, as verse 6 in the English says, the conclusion the prophet comes to is, and for you, return to your God. I think that is definitely a big point here, but also, with the lexical connections of Baha, Bayit Hanan, that kind of also ties in as well with the reconciliation with Esau. So in the same way that the people ought to reconcile with Yahweh, they are also to reconcile with each other, as we talked about the different social issues going on, the depriving of the poor. I think those go hand in hand. It's not just purely like a religious, spiritual notion, but it's also very practical, social, at a social level as well. I think both go together. And so it continues on in that verse. It talks about he met him at Bethel. There he spoke with him. This is also ambiguous. Who's meeting whom? I think, given what the interpretation I just offered, it makes sense that God met Jacob at Bethel, because Jacob is entreating the Lord for favor. And so God appears or meets him at Bethel. You could read it either way. I mean, the implication, the difference between those two readings is pretty slim, I suppose. It is interesting in the Hebrew, in the NRSV it says, and there he spoke with him. I think the Hebrew, it says, Vesham Yedaber Imanu. He spoke with us. Now, some people would suggest amending that to him, because in the previous line we see he met him. So maybe the scribe, got confused, or maybe it was supposed to be him or whatever. I think with us actually makes a lot of sense in light of what we know, that Jacob, the story of Jacob here, is somehow representative of the people. And so even though he's talking about these stories, these events that happened a long time ago, in some way, God meeting with Jacob is like with meeting the people of Israel. I think there is a present day applicability. So maybe it is kind of both in a way, or with us might be an even better reading. I think if you look at the Septuagint as well, maybe, I think there's some versions that have with us. So there is some kind of ambiguity in some of the different witnesses if you look at other texts and how they're translating this. Either way, that's an interesting aspect of it. Continuing on verse 5, the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name. So it's reminding this is Yahweh that is coming to Jacob at Bethel. And as for you, return to your God, hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. So I think this is what Hosea is coming to, with the whole point of reciting these events, the story of Jacob, is to come to this conclusion that somehow Jacob's life, Jacob's story, is supposed to come to this conclusion that Israel needs to repent. And I think the best way to make sense of that is to understand that in the same way that Jacob initiated this strife and was conflicting with his brother and with God, Israel has done that too, through the series of different violations and cultic things they've done, worshiping other gods and treaties with other countries and whatnot. But also in the sense that he wept and sought his favor, that is perfectly ties into this message of returning to keeping chesed mishpat, to hold fast to love and justice. That this message is complementary to both of those aims. So that's really the bulk of most of my interpretation here. When we go on, we see additional sections about a trader in whose hands are false balances. We see that word mirma come up again. Let's see, in that verse. Yeah, there it is. So we repeat that same idea of deceit, but now we're going to play it back over again, and specifically mention the trading, the economic practices that Israel is doing, cheating the poor essentially. And Ephraim says, I am rich, I have gained wealth for myself, and all my gain, no offense has been found in me that would be sin. This is really funny, actually. This has lots of puns, with the word for wealth, and I'd have to look at it. Let's see. Yeah, it says matsati only, and then also yimseu li avon. So it's kind of contrasting this idea of wealth and iniquity. That actually, I think the implication is the wealth of Ephraim is actually the source of their iniquity. It's kind of this little pun off of on and avon, which are similar kind of sounding words. And then he kind of continues on, I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. I will make you live in tents again, as in the days of the appointed festival. So once again, we see this return kind of to the past. It's kind of ambiguous. What exactly are these days of the appointed festival? What point is it exactly referring to, like in the wilderness or whatnot? But either way, it's referring back to, I think, these days in the past, which also complements several other points in Hosea. He talks about returning to the wilderness. So in Hosea, I think 2 or 3, there's that call of returning to the wilderness, and God will woo them back. So it's kind of like we need to go back to the beginning. We need to start over again, because that's where reconciliation will really happen. And then if we can just kind of skip down to verse 12, we see this next reference to Jacob. And I also spend some time trying to understand this because it's tricky. It says, Jacob fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife. For a wife, he guarded sheep. By a prophet, the Lord brought up Israel from Egypt, and by a prophet, he was guarded. And so this is another instance of he's referencing the life of Jacob, but it's a little unclear, at least to me and some other interpreters, like what exactly is the implication here, because he sets these two images side by side, but what's the connection? Is it a negative contrast? Is he contrasting Jacob and the prophet, or is there some sort of similarity? And ultimately, I focus on the repetition of shamar. So if you look at the end of verse 12 and in Hebrew, verse 13, shamar, in most English translations, it will say he guarded sheep. It doesn't have sheep. There's no reference to sheep there. Now, that could be the implication, but the emphasis is on shamar. That's the point.
Yeah.
But then when you look at the next verse, you see that next shamar at the end as well, by a prophet, nishmar. So I think what's happening here is that in some respect, the act of Jacob shamaring, of guarding, is on analogy with Yahweh guarding Israel through the prophet or by the prophet.
Can I
Now,
interject just for a moment on
sure.
that point? So, I mean, of course, the first prophet is Abraham. I mean, he's called a prophet, right? In Genesis 20, Abraham is called a prophet. And with Jacob having his dream and his visions and the encounters he's having with Yahweh suggests that Jacob is a prophet as well. So it's really interesting you're making this point, because I think that's exactly what the text is doing here. It's showing us that Jacob, the patriarchs, are in fact part of the prophetic tradition. That is ultimately the way the later prophets are obviously, I think, interpreting the previous stories potentially. So,
Right.
So what a great connection there with the shamar on both ends, referring obviously to Moses and to
jump off on that too. We think about Genesis 49 with Jacob's famous the poem that I think is very much depicted as something with prophecy.
That's a
in
good
some
point.
sort of sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point about Jacob being like a prophet, because there is this analogy being set up between the prophet. I mean, he doesn't mention Moses, but it's definitely like kind of this oblique reference to Moses here, bringing up Israel out of Egypt, whatnot. And then Jacob being kind of like a Moses figure.
Yeah.
And that's interesting just by itself,
Does anyone say that? I mean, have I read this in the I don't know. I don't feel like I've read this in the commentaries about the patriarchs on the prophetic level. So
I don't think I ever actually bring that up or read anything specifically in this context of Jacob being like a prophet.
Jonathan Finley next year at SPL presenting a paper on.
Well, I wouldn't want to steal your idea. I think you should go present it.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, we could do it together. I mean, Hosea's doing it, obviously. That's the interesting thing here, is you've obviously made the connection yourself in the thesis. And I think the prophets, Hosea, the writer, the author here, obviously is looking back at the patriarchs and making that same connection. I think we just all miss it because we're not thinking about the fact that the patriarchs are presented as prophets in Genesis.
Right.
So
no, you're right. I mean, the first usage of prophet in the Hebrew Bible is in reference to Abraham. It's not just like, does he act like a prophet here?
Right.
I mean, the text explicitly, I'd have to pull up which verse it is, but he is called a prophet.
That idea just kind of reminds me of that rabbinic saying I've heard that go like, Ma'aseh Avot Simcha Levayim, or something like the deeds of the fathers are assigned to the sons, or something like that. So it's like Jacob's life is in some sense prophetic of Israel's experience.
Interesting.
So
and then at the very least, I still think Genesis 49 is a really important passage.
Yeah,
it's one of our archaic Hebrew portions of the Hebrew Bible, and that plays a really important role, like looking forward to, and however you want to parse that out. I mean, that is a case where you could actually compare his words in that chapter to elements that we would often compare with prophets, including even style when it comes to the poetry. So
that's true.
That's you've really opened up. I think a lot of area. I think a lot of our listeners are going to, study some passages afresh and anew now, going back to intertextuality, which is one of your big passions, trying to make these connections. And I
guess to clarify, with my paper, I didn't really try to present it as an intertextual paper, because when I started getting into it, it just seemed really messy when we talk about, what source is this? How are we going to date Genesis and all this stuff? And like Hosea, what we're going to do with all this stuff? And I don't know. I just wanted to focus on the text. I wanted to focus on Hosea and how is it working here in this literary context. That's really what I'm getting at. So I want to be careful, and like, I don't want it to make it sound like I'm assuming dependency or like making these connections.
No, it makes sense.
That's a fair clarification. I guess it's just, I know that intertextuality in general is something that you really enjoy.
I mean intertextuality in like the synchronic sense of like seeing these texts side by side and how they kind of discuss like inform each other, I suppose. And necessarily like I'm not necessarily trying to like argue that Hosea is reading Genesis or vice versa, or however you want to say, but it's like
I'll happily
But
argue it for you, so we'll be okay there.
but like at the very least, like I do say the obvious point that it's clear that Hosea is familiar with Jacob in some form. Like if you want to say in the form of Genesis or in some other tradition, I just kind of put it like the Jacob tradition. I don't necessarily want to try to argue, the dating of Genesis and all this stuff. I mean, it might very well be the case, but just kind of avoid that. I don't try to go into
Smart.
it, but
Yeah. Just let Kenneth Kitchen do all that. That's fine. You just let him tell us.
That's great. That's great. Man, there's so much that we could unpack here, Jonathan. I've just kind of been letting you just go. You're on a roll with these verses, and I think this is great for people to hear someone. Let's just go, hey, line by line. Which, by the way, we do a lot of that in our Hear About Book Club. We do that style quite a bit on those monthly live meetups where it's just, hey, let's just open up a chapter of the Bible and let's just line by line just go through this. And it's interesting what you see when you actually do a close reading. You compare the textual witnesses, you get into the scholarship. There's just some excellent content. And I think what people are also feeling as you describe things, some people think that the devotional and the academic can't go together, that it's almost like they're opposed to each other. That, okay, you can do academic stuff, but it's just a cul-de-sac, it's just a swamp, it's a dead end, there's nothing that can live there. But in reality, I think that doing the deep work in the academic stuff to see what's going on in this context, how do we analyze this, I think it very much leads to, obviously, firstly, understanding this text in its original context, but that also leads to the best insights for how does this connect with the New Testament? What kind of message could this mean for us today? And it's important that we see how that connects. I think you're doing a really good job. Like, obviously, I know your main goal is just presenting your academic work, but I think for anyone who's really listening here, there's obvious implications for people, whether they think about their personal lives or the people who are going to communicate or preach on these topics. But they're insights that you wouldn't get from just a quick cursory reading of a text. You got to do that deep work.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's really one reason I like doing the prophets is they're so often misread or just not read at all. It's very confusing. I like the challenge of it. I think to really appreciate and understand the prophets, you have to read slowly. You have to give it time and let the language, because really the way the prophets work, it's word art. It's playing with words, and there's just a lot of beauty in the language itself. I mean, even in English, if you don't have Hebrew, you can still see these things. Some of them not as clearly as others, but like the puns and whatnot. But still, you have to give it time. And I think many of us don't really have the time or really want to spend the time to slow down. And sometimes doing that, taking that work to slow down and appreciate. When I read in Hebrew, obviously, I don't read as fast as in English, so it kind of forces me to slow down a little bit and think about what I'm reading, think about the words. And I could see just the intricateness, the beauty, it's whoever wrote this is very intelligent. Like, it's very well written, and I think I appreciate the message more when I can understand that and see that for myself.
It's good. Yeah.
Is there anything else from this chapter that you wanted to go talking to your research, or do you feel you've kind of put a bow on it?
No, I think that's a good overview of my general point I'm trying to make. I mean, there's lots of different little literary stuff we could discuss in this chapter, but the main thesis is really, how does Jacob work in this section? And I think bringing out the complexity of it can show how both the condemnation and the reconciliation fit within Hosea's rhetorical aims, and understanding how the past is somehow predictive of the future, or at least representative of the present reality. Like I said, when you read it just through, it seems to me like, at least initially when I was reading it, like, how is any of this relevant to contemporary Israel in Hosea's time? How is any of this relevant? But him citing these things, at the very least, implies it's relevant. And I think the logic is this this looking to the past as like a remedy for the future. For the present. And so when we go on to these other chapters, you'll see kind of this similar recalling of the past as like an answer in some way to what's happening today. And so actually that's a topic I'm considering for my PhD, is considering beyond this chapter, how does Hosea reference the past rhetorically? That's sort of a question I have that's bigger than just this chapter. And we'll see maybe if that can get fleshed out. But
I like that.
Okay, Dr. French, do you have any other thoughts, comments, or anything
Well,
that you want to add
Jonathan,
in?
yeah, I think this is excellent work, and I've read parts of your dissertation that you wrote, and I thought you're a very clear writer and very good writer. So I'm looking forward to some of the work that you're going to be bringing forth in the future. So thank you for that. Yeah, just a few thoughts. As you're going through verse 4 and 5, very interesting. We have et Elohim, right? So is it struggle with God, or is it with a divine being you have with the JPS translation, right? Then moving into Malach. So there's some interesting points here where they could use the divine name, which they don't. And so it's great how you stress that and brought all of that out. And then, of course, with the Vayit Chanen, whenever I say Chanen, you can't help but to think Exodus 34:6, Adonai Adonai El Rachum Vechanun, right? That he is a God who's gracious and compassionate. And the fact that that's coming up here as well on the repentance level, and there's still some Exodus elements sort of being brought back in that way, I think is very good. And then my final point for you, mentioning the Zichro, right, that we have here, as you were saying about how the prophet's reflecting on the past. And I think that's a really intuitive thing that you're bringing out, because obviously that's exactly what the prophets are doing again and again and again, and especially here. And I'd love to see more of your research on that point. So that might be a good one for a dissertation. So PhD.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really interested in that, just to see, like I said, how the biblical authors understand their own history, and how does that inform the past? I mean, the present, because us moderns don't always appreciate history, and I love history, and I think just the interpretation aspect, the hermeneutics of it, like how does this work hermeneutically, and seeing the rhetorical style of it is really interesting, and I think is important to read Hosea and also other prophets. Other prophets do this as well. Hosea is not alone in these kinds of references. So it's fascinating to me, really.
Excellent.
That's great. Jonathan, we really appreciate you sharing some of your research with us. You're a great, gifted teacher, and you really enjoy doing the research. So do you have any last concluding thoughts that you'd want to share with our listeners? And then also finally, tell us where you think the trajectory of Jonathan is going at this stage in your life when it comes to your research.
Well, I'm just starting out in this academic journey, so I don't have any resources to provide, but I want to apply for a PhD, so I'm currently doing that. And, we'll pray the Lord's will be done, and we'll see where I end up. But I'm excited about the future there. And then, for anyone that's listening, I assume if you're listening to this podcast, you love Hebrew Bible, or you're just interested in learning. And I would just encourage you to keep doing it. Like, find good teachers, people you like listening to, like Matthew, Nathan, or others. And just, remember there's always more to learn. I feel like when I started, my class at ORU, I felt like I understand the Bible well enough. And then I realized the more I've studied, there's just more and more to unpack, more to learn. And that enriches my faith. It's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. It enriches my understanding of God and who I am. And I think that can directly inform and benefit you personally, spiritually. So lean into that. If you're interested, ask good questions. Don't be afraid to ask hard questions, and find good teachers that you trust and just go into it, because it's the educational process is worth it.
It's good. In the words of Nathan that he says sometimes, amen, good preaching.
Amen, good preaching. Yes, indeed.
No, it's good. I definitely vibe with that. And we'd be happy for anyone. Join us along the journey as we're trying to make sense of the Hebrew Bible one episode at a time. There's Nathan and I have often talked, like we could do this podcast forever.
Yeah.
There are certain things that it's like, okay, let's do a docu-series, right? Like we have a very specific project. Here's where it begins. Here's where it ends. And that's great. Other people might think, hey, I want to talk about a specific topic, but am I going to run out of stuff? I am fully confident we will never run out of content to talk about.
Of course not. No.
On our podcast, because the Hebrew Bible is so expansive, and there is so much going on here on so many different levels and layers. So it's why we also enjoy bringing on guests to get their perspective as you're doing your research. So Jonathan, we'll have to have you back on again. Thanks for coming back to the podcast. You were one of the OG guests that I had whenever the podcast was more at the hobby level. And I wanted to have someone on because I'm like, man, I don't want to talk about myself all the time. I'm like, let me talk with Jonathan. And we had a really fun episode back then too, that I really enjoyed. So thanks for coming back to the podcast. And Dr. Nathan French, always great to have you as well, the resident scholar bringing the world level expertise from Jerusalem and the UK. Always wonderful. So thank you everyone for joining our podcast today, and we'll see you in the next episode.